Most people like to think they're doing fine, as long as they can get out of bed and occasionally remember what day it is. Which is great, except sometimes the things we call quirks are actually our brains quietly waving a small, polite distress flag. It's funny how you can assume you're just being productive or independent or whatever the latest personality trend is, when in the background your mind is probably filling out paperwork for a complaint you didn't know you filed. I'm not saying everything is secretly a mental health issue, but it's surprising how often the quote-unquote normal stuff ends up being the stuff that explains why we feel like a laptop that hasn't been plugged in since 2014. So today we're looking at a few habits that seem harmless until you realize, oh, that is strangely specific. And if you enjoy this kind of calm, existential review of your daily behavior, feel free to like the video and subscribe so we can continue pretending we're all holding it together. Chapter 1. Chronic overthinking and anxiety. The strange thing about overthinking is how it always feels productive, right up until you realize you've been mentally dissecting a 2-word text for the last 45 minutes. It starts small. Maybe someone says sure instead of okay, and suddenly your brain is running a full investigation, complete with imaginary witnesses and a motive chart. The wild part is that none of this is happening on purpose. Your brain is just doing what anxious brains like to do, scanning the horizon for threats that aren't there, then replaying them on a loop, like a broken playlist you forgot to delete. It's not that the thoughts are even interesting. Half the time it's just the same scenario running again and again, like your mind is trying to speedrun social interactions. Meanwhile, the part of your brain that's supposed to shut down the wandering, worrying thoughts, the default mode network, seems to have left the building entirely. So you get stuck in that familiar place where your body is sitting perfectly still, but your mind is sprinting laps around a conversation no one else remembers. And once you're in that loop, everything can start feeling bigger than it is, like a single awkward moment just turned into a full emotional documentary. Chapter 2. Irritability as a symptom of stress or anxiety. One of the funnier things about irritability is how it convinces you that everyone else is the problem. Not you, of course. You're perfectly calm. It's just the Wi-Fi, and the traffic light, and the pen someone is clicking 3 rooms away. All of them are clearly part of an organized effort to ruin your day. But underneath that heroic narrative, irritability is often what happens when your brain has been running on stress for too long. High cortisol basically turns your nervous system into a smoke alarm that goes off because someone made toast. So instead of feeling overwhelmed or sad or tired, you just feel annoyed constantly at everything. Even things that normally wouldn't make the top 200 on your list of problems. It's a very deceptive reaction too, because anger feels powerful, like you're taking a stand against the universe. Meanwhile, your brain is quietly trying to tell you it's running on fumes. You might snap at a printer for jamming again, but the printer is rarely the issue. It's more like the last straw in a day filled with invisible weight. And once that irritability becomes your default setting, it starts blending into everything so smoothly you barely notice it's there, until something tiny sets it off like a tripwire. Chapter 3. Extreme independence and avoidant patterns. The tricky thing about being extremely independent is that it looks impressive from the outside. You seem competent, organized, capable of assembling furniture without crying on the floor. But on the inside, it can feel a bit like you've installed an emotional do not disturb sign and accidentally left it on for several years. A lot of people pick up this habit without realizing where it came from. Maybe depending on someone went badly once, or several times, and your brain decided the safest plan was to never try that again. So now, every time someone offers help, you get the same reaction you'd have if they offered to hold your phone with wet hands. A polite no, followed by an internal alarm. Avoidant patterns are strange because they don't announce themselves. You just slowly start doing everything alone, convincing yourself it's easier, or that you, quote, just prefer it this way, even when part of you is exhausted by the effort. Letting someone close starts to feel risky, like lending out something fragile you're sure won't come back in one piece. And while hyper-independence can feel like strength, it also blocks connection in these subtle, inconvenient ways, like refusing software updates until half your apps stop working. You still function, technically, just not as smoothly as you think. Chapter 4. Persistent fatigue as a mental health indicator. There's a special kind of tired that goes way beyond I stayed up too late and wanders into my brain has entered low power mode without consulting me. It's the kind of fatigue where even simple tasks start to feel like logistical challenges. You look at the kitchen and think, not, I should make breakfast, but that's a long walk for someone in my condition. Most people chalk this up to being busy or getting older, But persistent exhaustion has a habit of showing up when the mind is under more pressure than it can comfortably process. When stress hangs around too long, cortisol levels get weird, sleep gets patchy, and your energy disappears like a phone battery that jumps from 80% to 3% for no reason. You wake up tired, you spend the day tired, and by evening, you're too tired to figure out why you're tired. What makes this version of fatigue tricky is that it doesn't always feel dramatic. It's quiet, almost reasonable, until you notice it's been following you around for weeks. It's your brain doing its best to keep you moving while also pulling the emergency brake at the same time. And after a while, that internal tug-of-war starts to show up in every part of your day, even the parts that used to feel easy. Chapter 5. Shyness Masking Social Anxiety. It's easy to write off shyness as just a personality trait, like preferring quiet corners or pretending phone calls are a rare and ancient ritual. But sometimes what looks like ordinary shyness is actually your brain treating every social situation like a high-stakes performance review. Even the smallest interaction can feel like you're being graded on breathing technique. Social anxiety has this talent for turning harmless moments into big events. You say one slightly awkward thing, and suddenly your mind is replaying it like a director's cut no one asked for. Meanwhile, you assume everyone else is analyzing you with the intensity of a panel of judges, when in reality, they're probably thinking about lunch. But your brain doesn't care. It's convinced the spotlight is on you, even in a dimly lit room with nobody paying attention. What makes this tougher is what's happening under the hood. The amygdala, basically your internal alarm system, gets so jumpy that even normal interactions feel risky. So you smile politely, keep conversations short, and hope no one notices you trying to merge into the wall. Over time, it stops feeling like, I'm just shy, and starts feeling like you're constantly dodging invisible tripwires. And that's when shyness becomes less of a personality quirk and more of a daily maze your brain keeps redrawing. Chapter 6. Isolation as a response to overwhelm. Wanting alone time is perfectly normal. Wanting only alone time, however, is usually a sign that your brain has quietly switched from recharging to full retreat mode. It starts subtly. Maybe you cancel a plan because you're tired, or you skip a call because talking feels like lifting a small car. Then suddenly it's been a month, and the only person you've spoken to consistently is the delivery driver, who now knows your snack preferences. What makes isolation confusing is that it often feels peaceful at first. You get space, quiet, the freedom to live like a cryptid who occasionally checks their notifications. But when solitude shifts from, this is nice, to, this is the only environment where I feel functional, that's usually overwhelm doing the steering. Depression, burnout, old emotional landmines. Any of these can convince your brain that avoiding everything is the safest strategy. The problem is that long-term isolation doesn't just reflect stress. It creates more of it. Stress hormones rise, dopamine drops, and socializing starts to feel like running a marathon while wearing cement shoes. The longer you stay away, the heavier the door back out becomes. Before you know it, you're not choosing solitude anymore. You're just maintaining it, because returning to normal life feels like trying to rejoin a group chat you left 3 years ago. Chapter 7. Overorganization and obsessive tendencies. There's being organized, and then there's the kind of organization where your spice rack has a stricter filing system than most government agencies. It starts out looking productive. Clean space, tidy desk, color-coded everything. Very aesthetic. But sometimes that level of precision is less, I enjoy order, and more, if this pencil isn't exactly where it belongs, something terrible will happen, and I don't know what, but I'm not willing to risk it. Anxiety has a way of sneaking into harmless habits like that. When life feels unpredictable, controlling tiny details becomes a way of convincing yourself you still have a grip on things. You can't control the unexpected email, or the sudden change in plans, or whatever chaos tomorrow brings, but you can control the exact angle of your towels, and your brain will happily latch onto that because it's easier to refold a blanket 8 times than to sit with uncertainty for 10 seconds. What makes this tricky is that the behavior doesn't look harmful. It looks responsible, admirable even. But if being slightly disorganized makes your soul leave your body, or if your day falls apart because a label is crooked, that's usually less about neatness and more about managing a feeling you don't want to deal with directly. It's the illusion of control, just presented in a very tidy package. Chapter 8. Perfectionism as an anxiety-driven pattern. Perfectionism is one of those things that sounds admirable until you actually try living with it. On paper, it looks like high standards. In reality, it's more like auditioning for a role you already have, while assuming you're on the verge of being fired. Every task becomes a test, and every small flaw feels like it deserves a formal apology letter. What's sneaky about perfectionism is that it doesn't always push you to do more. Sometimes it freezes you completely. You stare at a blank page, not because you have no ideas, but because the idea of producing anything less than flawless feels like a personal attack. And when you finally finish something, the celebration lasts about 3 seconds before your brain points out everything you could have done better. A lot of this comes from anxiety doing its usual thing, trying to keep you safe by convincing you that failure is catastrophic and success only counts if it's spotless. So instead of enjoying your accomplishments, you end up zooming in on imperfections, like you're reviewing security footage for clues. And the frustrating part is that perfectionism looks productive from the outside, when on the inside, it's more like running a race where the finish line keeps moving every time you get close. When you step back from all these habits, you start to see how quietly and cleverly people manage themselves without ever announcing it. And somewhere in that mix, you probably recognized a behavior or two that felt uncomfortably accurate. It's almost funny how the brain tries to help while also creating the very patterns we wonder about later. But once you notice them, they stop feeling like problems and start feeling more like clues. And while the mind has its subtle psychological routines, the body handles things in a much more hands-on way, especially while you're sleeping. It's doing a whole list of things you'd never guess, some of which sound like maintenance procedures from a horror movie. So if you're in the mood to keep unraveling the weirdness, the next topic will take you there pretty naturally. Think of it as continuing the tour, just a slightly messier part of it.